going to look at the breathing system and talk a little about respiration. So, what would I like you to know under the heading of the breathing system, or the respiratory system as it's sometimes called? Well, I'd like everyone to know the functions of all the different parts of the breathing system. I'd also like people to try to learn the path that air takes once it goes in through our nose and mouth. How does it get into our blood? And then it'd be great as well if you could learn a little about how the alveolus works for exchanging gases with our blood. So those are the three topics that we're going to be looking at starting today and in the next couple of classes. Some keywords that are going to be coming up in this section are trachea, bronchus, bronchioles, alveoli, and diffusion. And you should understand most of those by the end of this presentation and certainly in the next class as well. Now, here's the structure of our breathing system. There's also a copy of this in your textbook, which is slightly more basic, so you can draw either that one from your textbook or this one from the slide into your copies, please, for our next class. And let's start with some of the functions. So, how does this work? First of all, we'll start up here at the top of our breathing system, and it has a tube coming down the middle here called the trachea. Now, another name for the trachea is the windpipe. You might have heard it referred to as windpipe before. The function of the trachea there is to bring the air down from the nose and mouth, which will be up here, down into the lungs, or down towards the lungs at least. The trachea also has, and you'll notice these little rings around it. Those little rings here are called the rings of cartilage. And those rings of cartilage help to keep the trachea open when you're breathing so that it doesn't collapse in on itself, and that would smother you if it did. You'll notice that they're also on these smaller tubes here, the bronchi as well, but you'll notice that they're not on the teeny tiniest little tubes down here, and we'll talk about that in our second presentation. But for now, we need to know that the trachea brings the air from the nose and mouth down towards the lungs. Right up here at the top of the trachea, you'll see this little bone here. That's part of what's called the voice box, or the larynx. And the larynx, or voice box, does exactly what it says on the tin. It makes sounds that we convert into our speech. And how it does that is the air flows over some cords called the vocal cords and causes them to vibrate. And then those vibrations make a noise which your tongue and your mouth form into words and sound. Let's move down a little bit. So here's our trachea. You'll notice that when the trachea gets down here into your chest cavity, it divides into two branches, and each one of those branches is called a bronchus. The plural of bronchus is bronchi, so this gets replaced with an I, bronchi. Those bronchi carry the air from the trachea into the lungs, and that's about all you can say about those, except again to note that they have those rings of cartilage around them to help keep them open when you're breathing as well. Now, if we go down a little bit further, once we get into the lungs, we see there are tinier branches still coming from those bronchi, tiny little branches, and they're called the bronchioles, or sometimes you'd see them called the bronchioli. And those bronchioli don't have rings of cartilage over them, which means, unfortunately, that they could close over. And that is a problem for asthmatics, which we'll be studying in a later presentation. What's the function of the bronchioli, or the bronchioles? Well, they carry the air from the bigger tubes, the bronchi, all the way down to these little sacs down at the end of them. And those sacs are called the alveoli, or air sacs. Sometimes you'll see them called air sacs. And those alveoli, or air sacs, are where gas exchange actually happens. Now, there's a couple of extra bits that I haven't mentioned on this diagram. So far, we've traced the pathway of the air, but what are the other bits of our breathing system? Well, we have the ribs on the outside, and those ribs give protection to your lungs inside them. Then we have a lung here, and the function of the lung is to do gas exchange. And in order to understand how it exchanges gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, we'll have to look in a little bit more depth at these alveoli over here. And then you have some muscles. And the two main muscles that we need to know about for breathing are this sheet of muscle down here at the bottom that goes in a kind of an arch shape at the bottom of your chest cavity, or thorax as it's called. And that sheet of muscle is called the diaphragm. And that diaphragm is very important in your breathing. And then we also have these muscles over here called the intercostal muscles. Now, the intercostal muscles are here in between the ribs. So if you see, the ribs are the white bits here, and we've just cut down across them. Between each pair of ribs, there are intercostal muscles. And those intercostal muscles are also involved in moving the rib cage and helping us to breathe. Now, this brings us to a little task. So I have a video here taken from YouTube, just an introductory video about breathing, and I'd like you to watch it. And then in your copies, can you answer these little questions here? So state the function of the nose, the epiglottis, and cartilage, and all of those are mentioned in the video. And then down at the bottom, what happens during gas exchange? So why do we have this breathing system? What's the whole purpose of it? And finally, why is exercising good for your health? Or how does that help you with your breathing? You can pause the video while you look at that, or come back and revisit. So now I'm going to go on and look at the answers to those questions. So what does the nose do? Well, the nose has tiny little hairs that are growing in here that we can't really see on this person, and those hairs and the cells around them that produce mucus trap dust and bacteria, and that stops the dust and the bacteria from going down into your lungs and causing problems there, maybe causing infection down in your lungs. One other thing that the nose does is it warms the air. And if ever you've been really exercising hard and you do a sprint and you come back to your coach and the coach says, okay, in through the nose, out through the mouth, in through the nose, out through the mouth. And you're wondering, why is he saying this? I think I can get more air in through my mouth. Well, the reason is that when you warm that air in the nose, if you breathe in the air through the nose, it gets warmed more than it would if it just went in through your mouth. And when the air is warm, it's easier for that air to go into the bloodstream. So that's why it's good to breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth after exercise, to try and get the oxygen into your bloodstream quickly. That helps you to recover. Now, what is this epiglottis that's mentioned here? Well, when the air comes in through your nose and when it comes in through your mouth, it needs to travel down through your trachea. But there's a slight problem down here. When you try to swallow some food, that food could also accidentally go down into your trachea. But thankfully, we have a little flap of tissue called the epiglottis, and that epiglottis can cover over the trachea to stop the food from going down the wrong way, down into your lungs. And that ensures that instead of going down into the lungs, it actually goes down into your digestive system, which we studied before, through the esophagus. So that's what your epiglottis does, just a little flap of tissue that comes from the back of the mouth. And if you look at the two tubes here, it'll cover over one tube to make sure that the other tube is used for the food, and that the food doesn't go down here, down into your lungs. Now let's run through those functions again. So the trachea carries the air down to the lungs. It's kept open by the rings of cartilage. Hopefully you got that when you were watching the video. And it has some cilia on it. Cilia are tiny little hairs, just like we have in the nose, that trap the dust and move it up to the mouth again so that it can be swallowed down into the digestive system instead of coming down here into our lungs. Then the bronchi, and I said that each bronchus carries air from the trachea down into the lung. And then we have the bronchioles. Whoops, excuse me. Then we have the bronchioles. And those bronchioles, or bronchioli as they're sometimes called, are the smaller branches of these tubes. And they carry the air from the bigger ones, the bronchi, down as far as the little air sacs at the end of the tubes. What do those little air sacs or alveoli do then? Those alveoli look like a tiny little bunch of grapes, like this, or sometimes people say they look like cauliflower, and they're at the end of the tiny little tubes called the bronchioles. And their main function is to exchange gases with the blood. So you'll always have some blood flowing along beside them, and they can send gases into the blood and they can accept gases out of the blood. Now, can anyone remember what the main gas is that we want to get into our blood? Yes, it is oxygen. So the oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the blood. And what's the main gas that we want to get out of the blood? A waste gas that we want to breathe out through our mouths. Well, that is carbon dioxide. So there'll be a little bit more detail coming on that later. And now just to look again at the functions of the muscles. So we have the diaphragm here, which is our little sheet of muscle down at the bottom. And when that diaphragm contracts, it actually moves downwards. And when it moves downwards, it creates more space in here in our chest cavity. And because there's so much space in there, the air pressure is quite low, and that's what draws in air in through our nose and mouth to equalize that air pressure. The intercostal muscles are also involved in that process of drawing air in. The intercostal muscles, as I mentioned earlier, are here in between each pair of ribs. So those little intercostal muscles, when they contract, what happens is the ribs move up and out. And if the ribs move up and out, that again creates loads more space inside in your chest cavity. And if there's lots of space, that means there isn't that much pressure in there. And that means that again, the air is drawn in through your nose and mouth into your lungs. Now we're going to study how the alveoli work in just a little bit more depth here. So before we look at that, we need to understand a word called diffusion. You'll notice here I've a slight cartoon image, slightly funny or maybe slightly offensive cartoon image of a guy farting, and the girl is not all that happy with him. The fart smell is spreading from him over to her. And if you've ever been in a classroom where you have all of these seats in the classroom here. There's our back row, our second row, our third row. I know this doesn't look like my classroom, but let's just pretend for a minute. Here we are, and here's the teacher. Here's me up at the top. Okay, if a person sitting in this desk down here were to let off a little fart, the first thing that would happen is he'd notice the smell himself, and that's where the expression comes, "You smelt it, dealt it." But that fart smell, which is essentially little chemicals in the air, would spread outwards from a place where there's loads of fart smell towards all the places where there isn't much fart smell. So now we have person A and B here, and C are starting to get the smell. Then we move on, and it moves up to where some more boys are sitting here, D and E, F and G. The fart is spreading from an area where there's lots of that, where there's lots of fart smell to an area where there isn't much fart smell. Or if you think of it, that's the chemicals in the air diffusing outwards. And who's the last person to notice that there's a smell of fart in the room? The person who's continuing on teaching, that's me up here. I'll eventually get that smell of fart. So how does that relate to your breathing? Well, it explains a process called diffusion. Diffusion is when a substance moves from a place where there's loads of it to a place where there isn't much of it. Or, to put it in more scientific language, when a substance moves from an area of high concentration. An area of high concentration means where there's lots of that substance. So in the area where the fart was released, we'll say, to an area of low concentration, meaning to a place where there isn't much of it. So all the way out here, all around the class, to offend everybody in the class. So that's what diffusion means. And that diffusion actually happens in our lungs when we get to the air sacs. So here we have a little diagram of an air sac. Remember we said that the air sacs are at the end of our bronchioles and they look effectively like a little bunch of grapes. So here's our little bunch of grapes, if you can see them here. And the air is coming in from our bronchioles and from the bronchi and from the trachea, etc., etc. So it's going up like this, da, 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 and up to the mouth. So the air is coming in that way, down into our air sacs. Now, this little thing that we have drawn along here is what's called a capillary. And a capillary is a blood vessel, so it's carrying blood, that has a really thin wall, only one cell thick. So it's a very thin wall. And the reason that's useful is it can be used for exchanging things. So things can easily pass through that wall into and out of the capillary. And we would have mentioned these before when we were doing our digestive system, when we were talking about absorption in the digestive system. So when the air comes down, it goes into our little air sacs, and the blood is flowing by past these air sacs. And now that blood has collected carbon dioxide from all the cells of the body. So it's absolutely full up with loads of carbon dioxide. So what happens when it gets to the air sacs? Well, the carbon dioxide, you see these little black arrows, the carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood. And what do I mean by diffuses? I mean it goes from a place where there's loads of it in the blood to a place where there isn't that much of it. And that's the air in here in the air sacs, because that's the air we're just after breathing in. It has lots of oxygen and not so much carbon dioxide. So again, the carbon dioxide diffuses from a place where there's loads of it from the blood out to the air sacs, and then it will continue on up through the bronchioles, through the bronchi, and out of the body, up to the mouth and out of the body. At the same time, why is this called a gas exchange? Well, oxygen that was in the air that we breathed in will diffuse from the air sacs into the blood, because there isn't that much in the blood at the moment. So the oxygen diffuses into the blood, then it gets carried away in the little capillary, and it goes out of the lungs up to the heart, and that lovely oxygenated blood that's full of oxygen is going to be pumped all around the body. So that's what happens in our air sacs, and that's called gas exchange or gaseous exchange, meaning the oxygen is exchanged for the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide comes out of the blood and the oxygen goes into the blood. So just quickly to run through what the alveoli are. They're tiny little air sacs, and they're found in the lungs where gas exchange happens. The alveoli have very thin walls and are surrounded by these blood capillaries, these tiny little blood vessels with thin walls. And that allows the gases to easily diffuse in and out of your alveoli. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus into the capillary. So oxygen from the alveolus or air sac into the capillary, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the capillary into the alveolus. And that's the little exchange of gases that we were talking about. Now, that brings us to our next little video, which shows you about that gas exchange. Now, some of the terms in the video are slightly beyond the scope of the course, but it might help to just expand what you've learned so far about the breathing and the gas exchange. Now, I'd like you, when you watch the video, to answer these 4 questions. Name the air sacs in the lungs. What happens to the air in these air sacs? Name the process that takes place, and a clue is that starts with a D. And how are the alveoli adapted for gas exchange? And what that means is, how are they special? What's so special about the alveoli that helps them to do their job? You can pause the video here again while you go off and look at that little clip on YouTube and answer the questions. Now, not much to go in today's class. So, just a little recap there on what the alveoli do. They're surrounded by tiny capillaries, and that's where gas exchange happens. And the adaptations that we were looking for there on that last slide are that their walls are only 1 cell thick. And that helps because it's really easy for the gases to diffuse through them. If they were really thick walls, then it'd be very hard for things to pass through them. They have a dense capillary network, which means they're surrounded by loads of those little blood capillaries. And that gives what's called a big surface area for the swapping. If you only had one capillary in there, there wouldn't be much space for the swapping to happen. Whereas if you've loads and loads of capillaries, then there's loads of space for that swapping or that exchange of gases to happen. And the last thing is that the alveoli are moist. And if you remember, I mentioned that when we were talking about the nose as well. If the air is nice and moist, it helps it to diffuse in and out. It's much better at diffusing when it's wet than it is if it's dry. And that brings us to a little task. I'd like you, in your copies, please, to write out this little paragraph and fill in the gaps. Okay. And then your last task for today's class is to answer these couple of questions. What happens to your breathing rate when you, number 1, sleep, number 2, walk, and number 3, run? And can you suggest reasons for each of these? So if you could complete those tasks in your copy, please, and then submit those for our next class, which is on Friday. That's the end of today's presentation.